Hey class, this is my week 10 reading response. So this week we've been reading and talking about health among the transgender communities. I think when we talk about transgender health, one of the sort of places I like to start is talking about this notion of gender identity. I think our world is primarily operating under what's called the gender binary, which sort of is this idea that we group humans, animals, plant life, many things into male or female categories. And I think we're at a point in time where we're seeing a lot of people sort of step out of this. And the transgender community is definitely one community, or I should say, a collection of communities that sort of brings gender identity into the forefront of healthcare. I don't think that healthcare, among everything else, should operate under the gender binary. I think, we've been seeing a lot of liberation among the transgender community in addition to perpetual violence. But we've also been seeing a lot of individuals who, identify as gender queer, gender nonconforming, non-binary, agender. I mean, the identity categories are almost endless. But I think it's important to talk about because we as healthcare providers, we need to acknowledge that the gender binary is a dominant sort of ideology that exists, and it's very invisible. I don't identify as male or female, but sometimes, being that I was raised in a sort of society that, made me think I was male and categorized myself as male, it's interesting to sort of see myself even screw up with my own pronouns. But I think, when we talk about transgender health, not only do we have, individuals who sort of transition their gender, whether it's physically or through, pronoun adoption, we do need to start a discourse on gender identity. I think it's something that, especially in the doctor's office, it's malnourished. But I also wanted to talk about this segment that sort of I saw in our discussion board about the Kaufman article and sex work. And this discussion sort of brought forward some memories from last quarter when we were talking about sort of the integration of sexual orientation, gender identity, sexuality, sexual identity, these sorts of concepts into health research. And I think what Kaufman was trying to do was meant to be better than it ended up being. I think the one thing that bothered me was that when we were talking about the sex workers, transgender or non-transgender, cisgendered sex workers might actually have a lot more similarities as to the reasons why they went into sex work than not. And I think while it's important to integrate sexual orientation, sexual identity, transgender identity, these sorts of ideas into research and healthcare practice, sometimes I feel like we use it a little too extremely in a way where it might actually just end up ostracizing a group for, based on their identity. So I think sort of what we were talking about, I know Kurt mentioned this in his discussion, but I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is that people are people first. And I really like that Kurt wrote that because a lot of times we get caught up with transgender person or genderqueer person or gay man or this, that, and the other thing. And I think sometimes we sort of forget that we're all human, we're all alive, we're all beings before we are the labels that we use through language to describe ourselves. So I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, is that everyone deserves, to be acknowledged as a living being, a human, and by doing that, by sort of holding that sort of notion in mind, we might be able to sort of better integrate, these other demographics into research and healthcare practice. Because I think if we're obsessed with them, if we're using them to an extreme, when the certain public health concern, like in this case, sex work, there's a lot of similarities between someone who's transgender and someone who's not in terms of why they went into it. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge people's humanity first, their human identity first. We language, is all over the place. Gender identity, the labels we use for all these things are everywhere, and it is very sort of subjective in the sense that we should respect how people want to be labeled, how they label themselves. And it's really not our room to sort of question that. But I think it's really important that we sort of talk about all this stuff in healthcare settings, because the more we talk about gender identity, the more that we allow people to feel like they're included, even if they identify outside of the gender binary or their sexual orientation spectrum. We're going to develop a community, a situation in healthcare where we're going to have more inclusivity. And whether or not that focuses on transgender identity in research or not, I think it's important to sort of always put someone's humanity first. So I just wanted to do a video this week. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Thank you.